a lonely lumberjack, a girl sold by her father in the middle of a muddy frontier market, and a secret growing inside her that would change everything. In the vast frozen wilderness of 1847, Oregon, Jonas Whitmore asked God for a family. He didn't expect the answer to come wrapped in shame, silence, and a stranger's unborn child. But what began as an act of mercy soon became a battle against whispers, judgment, and a past that refused to die quietly. And when the storm came, Jonas had to choose: protect the peace he built or defend the family no one else believed in. Nestled deep within the pine-covered hills of Oregon Territory in 1847, his log cabin stood like a forgotten prayer, small, sturdy, and silent. The air smelled of sap and wood smoke, and each dawn arrived with the rhythm of his axe biting into frozen trees. The towering pines listened, but never answered. Jonas was not a cruel man, nor particularly tragic. He was simply alone. He had come west like many men, with a dream in one hand and a past too heavy to carry in the other. But unlike the others, Jonas had no wife to call him in for supper, no children to trace muddy boot prints across the floor. Just the ticking clock of days passing, marked only by stacked firewood and solitary meals eaten by candlelight. Each evening, after the sweat of honest labor and a supper of beans and bacon, Jonas would kneel by a wooden cross nailed into the wall above his hearth. His prayer was always the same, worn smooth by repetition. Lord, I don't ask for riches. I don't ask for comfort. Just send someone who won't fear the quiet, someone who won't mind the sound of wind through trees, and a man who talks more with his hands than his voice. There were days he wondered if heaven had simply forgotten him. Still he prayed. Sometimes he carved a little cradle out of pine, his hands moving without reason, his heart whispering what his lips could not. He stored the carvings in a box beneath his bed, foolish as it seemed. Perhaps it was habit, or maybe it was hope, dressed in the only coat he had left: stubbornness. Jonas didn't believe in grand miracles. He believed in small mercies like warm firelight, dry boots, and the chance, however distant, that someday someone might fill the second chair across his dinner table. What he did not know was that fate had already begun its quiet descent, like snow settling on the roof, silent, steady, and utterly unstoppable. The Saturday market in Portland bustled with the usual rhythm of autumn. Wooden wheels creaked across muddy lanes, voices rose and fell in haggles over flour and lamp oil, and the smell of fresh bread floated through the air like a hymn from a distant church. But to Jonas Whitmore, fresh off the mountain trail and with a list of supplies in his coat pocket, the noise felt like a wave crashing over still waters. He moved through the crowd like a shadow, tall, broad, and quiet, carrying the weight of trees and silence. His boots were caked with forest dirt, and his beard held the chill of higher altitudes. He came to town only once a month, just long enough to buy what he needed and leave before anyone could ask too many questions. But this time something made him stop. It was a voice, sharp, harsh, too loud. "Sarah, stand up straight," barked a thin, wiry man with wild gray hair and eyes like burnt coals. He stood beside a weathered wagon near the feed store, gripping the arm of a young woman as if she were a stubborn mule. "Don't make me look bad in front of decent folks." Jonas paused. The girl, no, she was barely a woman, stood still, shoulders tight and eyes cast downward. Her dress, once blue, hung limp with age and dirt. A single braid ran down her back like a line drawn in dust. But what struck Jonas most was the way she held herself, not with rebellion, not with fear, but with the worn grace of someone who had weathered too many storms to flinch at rain. The man's voice rose again now to the crowd. 17 years old, strong, knows how to cook, clean, tend a fire. I'll take $50 from any man who can give her a home." A murmur rolled through the townspeople. Some turned away in disgust. Others watched with poorly hidden interest. Jonas's stomach turned. He had seen things in the forest: wounded wolves, trapped deer, but this was worse. This was a father selling his daughter like cordwood before winter. A father who'd likely gambled away his soul one whiskey bottle at a time and now stood shouting her price into the wind. The girl's eyes briefly met Jonas's. Green, clear, not begging, just tired. And in that second Jonas felt the ground shift beneath him, not with fear or pity, but with recognition. He too knew the ache of being forgotten. He too had stood silent while the world moved on, without asking if he wanted to come along. A ranch hand near the front offered 45. Another man, the kind who chewed with his mouth open and beat his horses, smirked and raised it to 50. Jonas's fists curled at his sides. Then before he could stop himself, his voice cut through the cold air like an axe through bark. 60! The crowd turned. The girl's father froze, and Sarah for the first time blinked like someone waking from a long sleep. $60, Jonas repeated, but not to buy, for marriage if she agrees. The market square fell silent. Sarah's eyes didn't widen in fear or disbelief. They simply searched his face, steady as the wind through pine. He stepped closer. "My name's Jonas Whitmore. I live in a cabin up near the logging camps. It's quiet, it's honest, it's warm. I'm not looking for a servant, I'm looking for a life. To share." The girl looked at her father, then back at Jonas. And in a voice just above a whisper, she said, "Yes." The first night in the cabin was quiet, but not the kind of quiet Jonas was used to. It was different now. It breathed. Sarah stood at the hearth, carefully folding one of Jonas's worn flannel shirts. She hadn't said much since they arrived, just polite thank yous, soft replies, and long silences. Jonas didn't mind. He was a man of few words himself. But even in stillness, there was something in the way she moved, measured, cautious like a bird, unsure if the branch it landed on would hold. He watched her from his place at the table. A pot of beans simmered between them, and the fire crackled behind her. Her shadow stretched long against the log walls, as if even the room wasn't quite sure how to receive her yet. "You don't have to do that," Jonas said gently. "You're tired." "I like to keep my hands busy," she replied, not meeting his eyes. Jonas nodded. He understood. They sat for supper, 2 wooden bowls, 2 chairs, and for the first time in over a decade Jonas didn't eat alone. Still, he could feel the weight pressing in, not from her presence but from something she hadn't yet said. It hung in the air, fragile and taut. After the meal, Sarah stood by the window, her hand resting lightly on the sill. Outside, wind moved through the pines like a hymn, low and mournful. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally, her voice a whisper, barely louder than the fire. Jonas set down his mug. "You don't have to." "I do," she interrupted, still facing the window. "Because you deserve to know the truth, before this goes any further." Jonas said nothing, just waited. "My father didn't tell you everything." She drew in a breath and her shoulders stiffened. "I'm with child." The words settled into the room like snow, soft, heavy, final. Jonas leaned back in his chair, not in shock, but in thought. Sarah turned to face him slowly, her eyes searching his face for judgment, for disgust, for the first crack in his quiet decency. "I didn't choose it," she added. Her voice trembled now. "It wasn't love. It wasn't my will." A long silence followed. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside an owl called. Finally Jonas stood up, not with anger but with calm purpose. He crossed the room, stopping just short of where she stood. "Is it a child you want?" he asked softly. Sarah blinked. "What? Do you want to keep it?" She looked down, then up again. "At first I was scared. I thought it would be a curse, but now—" Her hand moved to her belly, gently, instinctively. "Now I think it's a blessing I didn't expect." Jonas nodded slowly. "I've prayed for a family for 17 years, Sarah," he said. "Every night beside that fire I've asked God to send me someone. I didn't think it'd come like this. But maybe this—" He paused, gesturing around the room to her. "To the tiny life not yet born. Maybe this is the answer. Just not in the way I imagined." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "You're not sending me away?" He shook his head. "You're not damaged goods, Sarah. You're someone who survived." A silence followed, one not of fear but of understanding. She stepped forward and for the first time allowed herself to cry, not from pain, but from the safety of knowing she wouldn't be alone. And Jonas, the man who'd once feared he'd die without ever being known, pulled her into an embrace that told her everything words could not. The days that followed moved like honey through a warm spoon, slow, sweet, and careful. Jonas had never been a man of ceremony. There were no wedding guests, no rings, no preacher on hand when he and Sarah became man and wife, just a quiet understanding by the fire, a gentle yes, and a cabin that slowly began to shift from his to theirs. Sarah woke before the sun. She wasn't one for idleness, despite what she'd endured. Jonas would often step outside to chop wood and return to find the hearth-swept coffee brewing and a loaf of fresh bread rising in a bowl covered with a checkered cloth. "I used to do this back home," she said one morning, kneading dough with quiet determination, "before everything changed." Jonas didn't ask what everything meant. He didn't need to. It was in the way her eyes softened when she touched the table, or the way her voice caught when she folded baby linens she'd stitched from scraps of old dresses. Her past was a bruise she carried with grace but never let define her. They made changes to the cabin together. Jonas pulled out the extra lumber he'd stored behind the shed and began building a cradle. Not one of his practice carvings this time, but a real one, sturdy, smooth, and curved, gently like a boat meant to carry something precious. Sarah embroidered tiny blankets. She made little shirts no bigger than her hand, humming softly as she worked by the firelight. There was laughter now, soft, unsure at first, like it hadn't been used in years. One evening Sarah burned the stew and Jonas teased her gently. She rolled her eyes and threw a crust of bread at him. They laughed until they cried. Another night they sat outside watching the stars. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, and Jonas, a man who had spoken more to trees than people, found himself whispering dreams out loud for the first time. "What do you think she'll be like?" Sarah asked, placing his hand over her growing belly. "Stubborn," he said. "If she's anything like you." Sarah chuckled. "Strong like her father." Jonas didn't correct her. He didn't need to. Inside the cabin, the second chair at the dinner table no longer sat cold. The extra pillow on the bed had meaning now. And when Jonas knelt by the wooden cross each night, his prayers weren't lonely anymore. They were full of names of hope, of a future unfolding one quiet moment at a time. Winter approached with its usual fury, and Jonas doubled the firewood stack. He reinforced the windows and sealed the roof. Sarah preserved fruit-packed jars and dried herbs. She even taught Jonas how to make a poultice for sore muscles. "You're a better healer than most doctors I've met," he said one evening, rubbing his shoulder. "I had to be," she replied, eyes distant for a moment. "When Mama died, there was no one else." He reached for her hand. "You're not alone anymore." The baby kicked for the first time in early November. Sarah stood still in the kitchen, her hand on her belly, her eyes wide. She moved. She whispered, "Jonas." She moved. He knelt beside her, pressing his rough palm against the curve of her abdomen, and when he felt the soft flutter beneath her skin, he let out a laugh, deep, joyful, and full of disbelief. In that moment the forest outside seemed to pause. The wind held its breath, and in the heart of the Oregon wilderness, a man who had once believed he'd die alone now knew he was no longer just surviving. He was living. The first snow came early that year. Fat, wet flakes drifted down from the gray sky, dusting the roof of the cabin and piling on the split logs stacked outside. Inside, the fire crackled warmly. Sarah sat by the window sewing a tiny bonnet while Jonas repaired the handle of her wash basin with hands that had built far heavier things. But peace, like the weather, never stayed long. It started with looks, the kind that cut deeper than words. Jonas first noticed it during his next trip to town, a few nods that didn't come, conversations that stopped when he entered the general store. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, handed him flour without a word and wouldn't meet his eyes. Then came the visit. Jonas was chopping wood out back when he heard the horses. 3 of them, their hooves crunching the early frost. He recognized the riders before they even dismounted: Tom Bradley, Pete Morrison, and Jake Williams, fellow loggers, men he had shared coffee and storm shelters with, men he thought were friends. "Afternoon," Jonas said, wiping sweat from his brow, wary but polite. Tom cleared his throat. "Can we talk, Jonas?" He nodded and led them toward the porch. Sarah watched through the window, her needle frozen mid-air. "It's about, your situation," Pete said carefully, eyes on the snow-dusted ground. "About Sarah." Jonas's jaw tensed. "What about her?" Jake shifted in his saddle. "Words going around town. That she was already pregnant when you married her. That you've been taken for a fool." Jonas said nothing. The wind blew across the clearing. Tom stepped forward. "Look, Jonas, you're a good man. But some folks think it doesn't look right. A young girl like that expecting another man's child living out here with you." "You mean married to me," Jonas said quietly. "Living in her home." "We're not judging," Pete added quickly. "But people talk. Some of the church women are saying it's improper, that it sets a bad example." A bad example of what? Jonas's voice had dropped an octave. "Of mercy." They didn't answer. Jake looked up. "The logging company's hearing things too. They're considering letting you go. Said the scandal's not good for business." Jonas stood still for a long moment. These were men whose lives he'd once helped save, hauling one from beneath a fallen pine, loaning another money during his wife's illness. And now, because of gossip and appearances, they stood here suggesting he throw his wife and unborn child into the cold. "No," he said at last. "No," Tom echoed, surprised. "I won't send her away, and I won't leave my home. You can tell the company whatever you want." He took a step closer. "But you tell them this too. I won't trade love for approval." The 3 men glanced at each other. Tom sighed. "Then God help you, Jonas. You've got a storm coming." As they rode off, snow began falling heavier. Jonas walked back inside. Sarah was still by the window, bonnet in her lap, eyes full of quiet panic. "What did they want?" she asked. He wrapped his arms around her gently. "To scare us." She rested her head against his chest. "And did they?" Jonas looked past her, out at the falling snow, the darkening sky, the cradle waiting by the fire. "Yes," he whispered, "but not enough to make me forget what matters." Outside, the wind howled louder, but inside their little cabin, 2 people held tightly to one another, not because the world believed in them, but because they had chosen to believe in each other. It was the sound of hooves, angry, fast, relentless, that made Jonas drop his axe. He stood frozen for a moment, heart thudding against his ribs, before stepping around the corner of the cabin. The spring thaw had left the ground muddy and soft, but the man on horseback didn't care. His mount tore through the clearing like a creature possessed, foam flying from its mouth. Sarah's father had returned. William McKenna looked worse than the last time Jonas had seen him. Gaunt eyes, bloodshot beard, untrimmed and wild. His clothes hung loose on his frame, stained with old drink and desperation. "Whitmore," he bellowed, pulling his horse to a stop with a jerk. "Get out here, we've got unfinished business." Jonas heard Sarah's sharp breath through the cabin window. He turned to her and spoke gently but firmly. "Stay inside." She nodded, hand instinctively covering her round belly. Jonas stepped forward, mud clinging to his boots. "You've got no business here." McKenna swung down from the saddle, wobbling slightly. His hands shook not from cold, but from whatever poison he'd been drinking. He spat into the dirt and sneered. "That girl I sold you damaged goods. You got swindled, Whitmore. I figure you owe me another 50 for the trouble." Jonas's jaw clenched. "You sold your daughter to settle your debts. You don't get a second payout." McKenna laughed, a dry, cruel sound. "What she told you, huh? That the baby's not mine? She doesn't even know who the father is." The words sliced the air like a blade. Behind the cabin window, Sarah's face turned pale. Jonas could see the flicker of shame in her eyes. He felt the rage begin to boil under his skin. "You listen to me," Jonas said, stepping forward, his voice like thunder wrapped in calm. You left her. She is my wife. That baby, whatever its past, is mine now. Mine to raise, mine to protect." McKenna sneered. "You're a fool. When that baby's born, everyone'll see." "She won't look a thing like you. You'll be the town's joke." Jonas stared him down. "Let them laugh." A few of the local loggers had followed McKenna. They gathered near the edge of the clearing, hungry for drama. Tom Brennan, Jake Williams, others who had once shared coffee with Jonas around a fire. Now they watched like spectators at a hanging. McKenna stepped closer, eyes glittering with venom. "I'll tell everyone what she is, what kind of girl you've married. I'll ruin her name and yours with it." Jonas didn't flinch. "Then, I suppose you should try." McKenna reached for the knife at his belt. "Too slow." Jonas's hand shot forward, grabbing his wrist with the strength of a man who'd felled pine giants for 2 decades. McKenna's face contorted as Jonas squeezed just enough to remind him that broken men shouldn't start fights they can't finish. "Get off my land." Jonas said each word deliberate. McKenna staggered back, clutching his wrist. "This isn't over." "Yes," Jonas replied, voice steady as steel. "It is." McKenna climbed back onto his horse, humiliated. The loggers, sensing the fight was done, turned away disappointed. No spectacle, no downfall, just a man standing guard over the only peace he'd ever known. Jonas returned to the cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for what he said, for all of it." Jonas took her hands, calloused fingers wrapping around delicate ones. "You don't apologize for his poison. You don't carry his shame." But as he pulled her into his arms, Jonas felt a crack inside a tiny sliver of doubt. Not in her, but in the world. In the way gossip could outpace truth. In the way cruelty echoed louder than love. Still, he held her, and in that embrace chose again and again not to believe the past, but to fight for the future. The scream tore through the cabin before dawn, slicing the silence like an axe through dry bark. Jonas was on his feet in seconds, heart pounding as if it had forgotten how to beat in rhythm. Sarah clutched the side of the bed, her breath ragged, her knuckles white. "It's time," she gasped between waves of pain. "The baby's coming. Now." Jonas lit the oil lamp with trembling hands. Shadows danced wildly across the cabin walls. It wasn't supposed to happen this soon. They still had a few weeks or so, they thought. The nearest doctor was 3 days' ride, an impossible journey in the middle of a snow-choked winter storm. Outside, the wind howled like a wild animal, throwing snow in thick sheets against the windows. Inside, the heat from the fire was losing ground fast. "Don't leave me," Sarah whispered, sweat already beading on her forehead. "I won't," Jonas said, steadying his voice even as fear coiled deep inside him. "I'm right here. We'll do this together." He moved quickly. The bed was already prepared. Sarah had insisted weeks ago. Clean linens, boiled water towels, folded with the kind of care only a woman expecting her first child would understand. He remembered every line from the doctor's manual he'd borrowed, every step he'd memorized by firelight. But none of it had prepared him for this. Sarah cried out again, her whole body arched with pain. Jonas sat beside her, wiping her forehead, holding her hand through each crushing contraction. "Tell me about the cradle," she gasped. "Please, just talk." Jonas nodded, his voice shaking but sure. "It's made from pine, the soft kind, sanded smooth like river stone. I carved flowers into the sides, like the ones you planted near the window." She smiled through the pain, a fragile, flickering thing. "Will she like it?" "She'll love it," he said, though his eyes were wet. Hours passed like years. The snow piled high outside, burying the world in silence. But inside the cabin there was only noise, shouts, gasps, the snapping of wood in the hearth, and the relentless pounding beat of Jonas's heart. Then suddenly, a shift. "I can't!" Sarah cried. "Something's wrong." Jonas knelt, looked, and saw it, the baby's head just barely crowning. "You can," he said, gripping her hand. "She's almost here. Just one more push." Sarah gathered what strength she had left and bore down with a cry that echoed through the forest. And then, as the wind outside screamed its final warning, the child slipped into Jonas's waiting hands. For a terrifying moment, the baby didn't move. She was so small, barely more than a bundle of damp skin and silence. Jonas held her close, heart frozen in fear. Then came the sound, a wail, thin, sharp, and full of life. Jonas laughed through his tears, wrapping the baby in the blanket Sarah had sewn from scraps of old dresses. "It's a girl," he said, voice cracking. Sarah, pale and trembling, looked up. "Let me see her." He placed the baby in her arms. Sarah cradled the child like she'd known her forever. "She's perfect." Jonas sat beside them, watching the two people who now filled every corner of his heart. "What do we name her?" Sarah asked. Jonas didn't hesitate. "Grace." Sarah smiled a real smile, full and radiant despite her exhaustion. "Grace Whitmore," she whispered. And in that moment, while the storm howled and the fire glowed and the world seemed held together by a thread, Jonas realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. Not now. Not ever again. In the weeks after Grace's birth, the snow slowly began to melt, revealing the earth beneath, as if the forest itself was exhaling after a long, hard winter. Jonas stood on the porch each morning with a cup of coffee in hand, listening to the gentle coos of his daughter from inside the cabin. He had built this home for one, but it now held 3 hearts, and each beat gave rhythm to a life he never dared imagine. Rumors still drifted through town like wood smoke. Some said Sarah had tricked him. Others claimed the baby wasn't his and never would be. A few even suggested he'd lost his mind, letting love blind him to reason. But Jonas had stopped listening to voices that weren't spoken under his roof. When he looked at Sarah, rocking Grace in her arms, singing softly in a voice roughened by sorrow but softened by hope, he didn't see a girl with a past. He saw a woman who had fought to survive and still knew how to love. And when he looked into Grace's eyes, bright blue like the sky after a storm, he saw neither scandal nor shame. He saw a miracle. One morning, as the sun broke through the pines and painted gold across their windows, Sarah reached for Jonas's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, then at the baby sleeping soundly in the hand-carved cradle beside the fire. "No," he said, "not for a second. The world could say what it pleased. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. Let them scorn." Because Jonas had learned something few ever do, that family is not born from blood alone, but from choice, quiet, steadfast, and sometimes courageous beyond measure. And in that cabin, wrapped in the scent of pine wood and bred with laughter beginning to fill the empty corners where echoes once lived, Jonas finally understood. He hadn't just found love. He'd found home. Some families are born. Others are built, one quiet act of kindness at a time. In the stillness of the Oregon woods, a man who once prayed only for silence found his answer in the form of love he never expected, not in blood, but in choice, not in perfection, but in grace. This story reminds us that the strongest families aren't always the ones we're given, but the ones we fight to keep, the ones we forgive, and the ones we grow into with open hands and an open heart. What would you have done in Jonas's place? If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who believes in second chances. And if your heart's still stirred, there's another story waiting just for you right here.